Welcome everyone. My name is Zsolt Darvas. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel, and I'm very pleased to chair our event today on innovative approaches to measure the real-time impact and risks of COVID. We know that the economic implications and also the social implications of the global coronavirus pandemic has been really devastating, but it's unfortunately rather difficult to monitor what's going on from day to day or from week to week, because standard economic indicators like employment or GDP or production are published with a quite significant delay. And the reason for the event for today is to explore some new and innovative approaches for measuring the impacts and risk of COVID. And I'm really pleased that we have three, or in fact, four excellent speakers that agreed to join this event today and share their new methodologies. Let me just briefly introduce them in the order they will speak. So first we will have Nicola Villa, who is Executive Vice President at the Strategic Growth of Mastercard. He will then followed by Georg Zachman, Senior Fellow at Bruegel, who is also working closely with Ben McWilliams, who is a research assistant, and they will share the presentation. And thirdly, Jamie Gracia, who is the Latin American Director of Social Progress Imperative, will more speak about social risks and social impacts of COVID. This is a live stream event. It also will be possible to watch back what we will be saying in the next hour. And I also would like to encourage you to ask questions or make comments. So you should go to Slido, so sli.do, then type innovation, and then you will see a place when you can type your questions or ask comments or any questions you might have. I will be monitoring the questions and comments that you will make, and I will also ask some of them from our speakers. But first of all, let's hear them. I asked each of them to speak about 10 minutes each, so we will have sufficient time for discussion. So now let me pass the floor to Nicola and ask you to give your initial presentation. Thank you.
So very many thanks for the invitation to speak today, to yourself, to our friends at Bruegel, and thanks to the audience for taking the time and listen to this brief intervention. So I've been asked by Zsolt to speak about how new innovative tools can be used to measure the real-time economic impact of the pandemic. And so, background on myself, I run our government engagement group globally, which is our instrument to public-private partnerships. And as part of that, I've been living, eating, breathing, COVID projects for the last 9 months. So why is Mastercard engaged into this space, and how do we work, and are we working with government agencies, especially around Europe, which is one of our large, I would say, partner pools. So first of all, Mastercard is a technology company that basically runs a network that connects 87 billion, enable 87 billion transactions with 2.5 billion users, 60 million merchants, and basically is a network that not only enable the execution on payments, right, but also through the network is able to carve out insights on how the spending and the spending pulse basically operates. And so we are able, through looking at the transactions in an anonymous way, to develop deep understandings of consumer behavior, attitudes, trends, and preferences. We also are able to understand and gain unique perspectives at the economic level. So we basically see how spend and policy is actually impacting some of the behaviors of the consumers of our network. And also we are able to enrich our data with third-party data to basically carve out insights. Traditionally, our clients, the banks and the retailers, have been using this data in an anonymized way to understand basically what was happening within and around their business. And in the last 9 months in Europe, we basically started to share those data and insights with government agencies to understand, again, the impact of the pandemic from a segment, from an industry, from a geographic perspective, but also helping some of those agencies understand how to plan for their recovery. So that's in a nutshell why Mastercard is here, speaking about the way we work with governments. So we've been able to carve out real-time data, which is basically the real advantage, right, in terms of technology, in 3 specific areas. We've been looking into what is happening to entire industries from a spending pulse perspective, say, for example, the tourism industry. We've then been able to deep dive into specific segments. So what is happening to the accommodation, to the eating out, to the travel entertainment, to the HoReCa segments. And also we've been able to carve out sometimes local insights to understand what happens at the macro granular level. So last summer in Paris and in many parts of Europe, we publish a shopopenings.com program, which basically will help those people in the lockdown understand whether their shops close to them were going to be open or not, and therefore they could basically go and buy their food by looking at whether payments were being made into those specific merchants, right? So we've been spanning between industry segments and geolocations. And the value of what we started to work on and realize ourselves is the usage of real-time data, right? So we saw many agencies and governments using standard economics indicator, like Zolt was saying, to try to figure out in real time what was going to happen, which was impossible. And so by sharing some of our data and some of our insights in specific, we've been able to help understand basically what was going on across virtually all the 26 member states and other countries outside of the EU. We did that, and we do this in full alignment with the European Union's data responsibility principles, right? So we are putting the individual at the center of everything we do from a data perspective, which also means behind ensuring integrity, innovation, social impact, transparency, accountability, and security and privacy, we also are able to anonymize all the data that we use, right? And therefore make use of it in partnership with governments without basically impacting any individual privacy concern. In fact, in the GDPR perspective, right, when we saw GDPR being announced and launched in Europe, we even turned that into a business. So we established a company based in Ireland called Truata, who's now basically initially used for anonymizing our own data at the moment that we publish them externally, but also other organizations, public and private, came to us and asked to use the same engine, right? So we basically turned that opportunity into a true business for us. So I wanted to quickly share some of the trends to give a bit of a glimpse of what we're working on with reference to some of the segments that we've been discussing and working on with many member states in Europe and with many agencies. So you see here a view on what we call the Homebody economy, right? So we're starting to look into how the eating out lifestyle has been basically behaving in a number of countries, in this case, in terms of domestic eating, right? And so we see from the data how year over year, right? So 2020 over 2019, the Italians have increased, right? They are going out and eating compared to what they've done before in their own country. Right? You see, for example, over the summers, how the Italians basically, as soon as the lockdown was relieved at the beginning of June, started to basically go out, socializing, as in eating with friends and family. We saw actually the Spanish do the same, to the extent in which in November, right, before the lockdowns kicked in again, both the Italians and the Spanish spend an average 50% more in eating out than we will spend in 2019. We also saw how the Americans followed a bit through that program, but also we saw, for example, how the UK consumers and the German consumers did not follow the same trend. Right? Germans who stayed at home preferred not to go to the local restaurants in principle, but they basically started to be more focused on their of staying at home. So they took away more than basically going to a restaurants. If you take a broader look in the tourism sector, we all know, of course, that international tourism basically was in large decline over the last summer. But we look, for example, how the domestic tourism behaved in a number of countries. And so you see how the Italians basically had been able to support their tourism by basically staying on holiday in their own country. This was also supported by a specific initiative that the Italian government created, providing vouchers and incentives to the tourists to basically spend in their own markets in their country. So you see how the curve steepens up in the summer, especially in periods like Ferragosto and so on. The Spanish actually did it a bit less, so less incentives from the national government, a higher hit from the lack of foreign tourism. So the Spanish tend to be a bit more home. And you see again how the UK and German consumers basically did not spend on accommodation, right, in their own countries as much as the Italians or the Spanish, right? So those in Germany and the UK tended to basically go for day trips, but they really stayed home versus basically moving into other markets. We have also seen, like in countries like Switzerland or like Austria, how domestic tourism was up almost 40% from the previous year. So people tended to stay home, right? And people started to behave in very different way, with the similar lockdown policy being developed. Again, the Southern European more going still on holiday and going out and eating. The Northern European, so the Central European, a bit more cautious, right? So staying home, not traveling cross-border as much as they did previously, and basically staying home more than basically going out and having dinner. These are examples of some of the trends that we've come across. Again, we could spend a couple of days diving into very similar data by market, by segments, and so on. What is interesting for us is how we started to engage over the summer with more than 25 agencies, right? So both ministries of tourism as well as destination marketing organizations of those government ministries, to help them understand what was happening to the tourist economy, right? So how impacted were corridors coming into their countries and into their markets from a tourist perspective. But also in some cases, we're working with now in understanding what does the recovery strategy for tourists look like, right? So how many people are now trying to book into the country? What happens, what type of shift in tourists were there? So how many more local tourists were versus international? And when we see the international coming back in the spring and the summer of 2021, when do we believe that it will come from? And we do this by combining our own data with third-party data, booking data, social media data, Instagram data, of course, as well as Twitter and Amadeus, which is booking data. But we also bring the government data together with that. So again, over the summer, we publish, again, with the French government, with OTP, which is the Paris Tourism Agency, a barometer of the tourist economy, a service which is provided every 2 weeks to all the small tourist operators into Paris to try to understand on a bi-weekly basis what is happening with tourism. How many of the tourists coming into my area in the city are coming from France, are coming from abroad? What do the tourists from abroad want to have when they come into my neighborhood? And how can I therefore adjust my offerings and my marketing initiative for the next 6 months, or for the recovery strategy, to basically better serve those new tourists that I didn't know were going to come into my location. So we are starting to bring this together with a number of agencies. Now, 3 learnings from all of this. First of all, we realized by being asked by many agencies to share our insight, the value of fresh data, real-time data, as the enabler to understand both what is happening, what was happening to the pandemic, but also to plan towards the recovery. We also saw how developing a holistic perspective in assessing the damage done by COVID was very important. So none of the organization's individual data can do and can provide the same insights than when you basically bring those data together. So public-private partnerships on the data, in data space, are starting to become a reality in this case, and especially in the tourism industry, in our point of view. And third, we see how digitization drives recovery. We are now seeing a number of agencies who are starting to plan for the recovery phase, who are bringing together data insights with a better view on when to disburse aid, how, where, and at what time, to specific layers of the economy which are particularly impacted. So instead of blanketing disbursement programs and aid to the entire SME sector, for example, we see governments starting to understand that in the tourist sector, in this geography, those SMEs have been impacted for 75% more than somewhere else. And so we see basically this idea of providing more surgical aid into those layers of the economy, the society that has been particularly affected. We are at the beginning of a journey in many ways. I mean, we started to work on this type of programs literally less than 12 months ago. But a lot of learning, a lot of capabilities that we're starting to put in place, a lot of rethinking about public-private partnerships, right? So what is the value of the private sector, the public sector, and the fintech sector, for example, is producing. And so we look forward to more and more of those creative constructs, which will, at the end of the day, help with an effective recovery strategy, using data, using payments, and using digitization as the accelerator of the recovery. Over to you, Zoltan.
Thank you, Nicola. It was really fascinating, and clearly you are in a great position to process such a large number of transactions via your global network. Now, let me ask two questions, one more conceptual and one more to the more recent data. That certainly in some industries, the credit card use is much more widespread than for others. I mean, quite obvious that for tourism and eating out, I mean, I think bulk of the payment is made by credit card transactions. But in other industries, perhaps it's less prevalent that people or even companies pay with a credit card. So my first question is, what kind of industries can your real-time data cover, and how do you think how well the approximation that you can get from the usage of credit card transactions? And the other question relates to these large differences across the five countries that you showed for the two examples, because, for example, it's very interesting to see that Spanish and Italian households eat a lot outside, but at the same time, if you look at your second chart, it showed that spending on domestic accommodation services, especially in the past few weeks, have been very, very low compared to last year. So maybe people just eat out in their home city or village and don't go anywhere. So is it the explanation for that? And but if it's that, can you give also maybe a more aggregate impact on how, let's say, more spending on eating out compensates for the lack of spending on hotels and other types of accommodation services?
Sure. Let me answer to the first question with a brief statement, and this is a saying that goes within the company since a while. So we always say that Amazon is not a river, Apple is not a fruit, and Mastercard is not a credit card company. We are a technology company that happens to have grown up in the credit card business, but over the last few years, we diversify in what we call the multi-rail payment strategy, right? So we serve our clients with credit cards, debit cards, commercial cards, peer-to-peer payments, ACH programs. So basically, we've been able to differentiate our product and our connections to different technologies. And so we don't have to rely only on the credit card transaction, but we can basically look into peer-to-peer communication. In places like the UK, we run the national ACH program, so we basically see payments beyond cards, right? So it's broader than cards. What we also do when we don't have the right information in some of the markets, but because we might not switch the transactions, we then enrich our data with third-party data that basically allow us to build a precise view of what is happening to the economy. We are never willing to go down to the individual transaction, right? But at the moment that you basically extrapolate and you're able to compare what happened this year versus last year in Italy, even if a sample of data is 40% of the entire sample, and you're able to cross-fertilize with social media data, you are able to understand the trends. Right? Basically, what we indicate are trends. We don't indicate the very precise granular transactional level because of policy regulatory, but also because of strategic perspective from Mastercard. So we seem to have basically built a clear enough picture. And again, we never share data sets. We are only able to share insights from the data that we have because of compliance and the GDPR perspective, comparing basically year over year. Right? So that is good enough, I would say, for Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Economy, tourism agencies to understand basically the trends into the economy. On your second question, it is a very complex, let's say, answer to give, and it's a very complex environment to focus on, right? So understand what happens. So why did the Italians go out? Why did the French stay a bit more home, and so on? So we are developing very specific programs to figure those questions out, right? So in the case of Italy, for example, we saw how, again, the policy launched by the government to incentivize people to go on holiday in Italy, the Italian people, had an impact not only on the accommodation, but also on the eating out, right? We also saw how Italian people increase their domestic spend on eating out because they will spend this money anyway going abroad, right? When they stayed at home, they decided to adopt the same lifestyle if they were on holiday. The Germans seem to have done a bit less. The Germans didn't spend as much in eating out as they did in Italy when they go on holiday there. When in Germany, they basically did a bit less. Interesting to me is to understand how government policy has impacted the tourism and the spend. We have seen, for example, in our data, how Greece has been able to attract more tourism than their peer in the Mediterranean area by providing a very clear view and policy on what was required to come into the country. At the beginning of the summer, they say you need to test to come in, you can come from those markets, you cannot come from those markets. And so somehow they eliminated the uncertainty that many tourists had. So if you look at how international tourism recovered, still below 2019 levels, in Greece versus, for example, Italy and Spain, Greece has recovered better. To the extent to which, if you look at Dubai introduced very early PCR tests for everybody coming in from holidays. And I think the data that I have here is their flight bookings between July 2020 and January 2021 increase of 686%. So clear policy and clear communication from the government on what can be, what could be, and what could not be done to come into a specific market literally had a dramatic impact on the tourist performance, right? And so again, the question is very complex, but these are some of the trends that we're starting to see, some of the lessons learned from some of the government agencies.
Let someone from on Slido ask a quick question from you. So let me quickly ask that before turning to Georg and Ben. So the question is whether you have analyzed the trends in tourism trends in light of the mobility restrictions, for example, on air and road restrictions within countries. So have you also tried to look at
yes
the restriction part?
And we see a correlation not only with the restriction, but with the way, as I mentioned before, government communicated about the restriction. Right? We see a correlation between, I'll give you an example. I traveled to my home country in Italy a month ago from Amsterdam. I had to fill in 5 pieces of paper, fill in a website and make a call. Last week for work, I went to Spain, and with one app, I basically got through the journey. So the way the Spanish government communicated to me on how to reach into the country was different from my own home government in Italy, right? And so those communication, clarity about policy, clarity about what you need to comply to or not, are fundamental in reopening corridors. And so the correlation in our data is very clear.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. Now, let me turn to our second economic type presentation by Georg Zachman and Ben McWilliams, who will look at the use of energy and also air pollution. So I'm very much excited to hear your presentation, Georg and Ben.
Okay, let me share my screen. So I think you should be able to see it right now. So what I would like to talk about is 2 data sets that we try to employ to track in close to real-time economic developments in different countries of the world, and essentially over time. And the first data set that I would like to present you is electricity demand data. And the nice feature about that is that essentially several dozens of national transmission system operators published their electricity demand data one day after the fact on their websites, and you can get an extremely detailed view of a lot of things when looking into these electricity demand data. We decided, for the sake of simplicity and presentation, to essentially just look into one aspect of that, which is the aggregate demand during typical working time, so from 8 to 18. And we process this data a bit by comparing it to the same weekday of the year before to make sure that we don't have the weekday effects, and we control it for temperature and holiday effects that happen in the different countries. And all this is available on our website. We, in principle, have about, I think, 40 different countries currently covered. Most of the European countries are there. We have data from Russia, Ukraine, as well as Georgia. I think we also have data on India and on the different parts of the United States. So there we have regional disaggregated data. Japan and a few other countries like Bolivia, for example. And when we look into the data, what we can observe is that a couple of countries really had like a waterfall type of drops in electricity consumption during the first wave of lockdowns. So you see here on the slide, for example, in India, the demand dropped essentially by 40 to 50% when the lockdown was announced overnight, and relatively slowly only recovered until mid-June. In Spain, the picture is about similar. So also there, electricity demand dropping by almost 40%. And in other countries, this is less pronounced, like in Poland, for example. What we also see is that, and that you cannot see here, but on the website, is that in the second wave, the lockdowns have seemingly had much less effect on the electricity consumption in the countries. Essentially, the load in most countries remains below the last year's value, but it is much closer now to last year's value, so at about 95% or so, while during the first lockdown it was at about 70%, 80%. What we also did to show a bit the value of the data is we correlated it with industrial production index, so that you see on the left lower panel here. And as you can see, there is quite a good correlation. So for a real-time short-term proxy, it's performing relatively well. But of course, much more can be done with this data. So it might be possible to explore also kind of the seasonality of the data more. So you have essentially electricity demand data for each hour, and you can try to identify differences between working hours and non-working hours, between weekends and non-weekends, and try to get much more signal out of the data. The downside of that, it's more difficult to explain what you are doing, and you need to have a clear purpose what you want to achieve with this data when you start going deeper into those manipulations. And another data source that is sometimes available for some countries is going down to a more regional level, and there it starts getting interesting, because you then can try to identify really individual industries that are sitting in different regions, and what happens to them based on this real-time data. And with that, because we have some gaps in the data coverage, we thought we also go for filling these gaps, and that's what Ben is currently looking into. Ben?
Thanks, Georg. Yep, so as Georg says, beyond the electricity tracker, we are also exploring another avenue for data, and that is air pollution. To give a brief overview of this data type, the EU has a project, the Copernicus project, which about 2.5 years ago launched a satellite which is able to track air pollutants in the air, and it provides the data on these at a daily basis and available within 24 hours of being recorded. So we look into, of these, nitrogen dioxide, a particular air pollutant. Why do we choose this? We choose it because nitrogen dioxide is emitted when you combust fossil fuels. So this means that the human contribution to this comes from activities such as, or particularly transport, electricity production, industry, and humans have a very significant contribution to the quantity of nitrogen dioxide in the air. More favorably, for a tracker, nitrogen dioxide doesn't stay in the air for a long period of time, on average about 12 hours, and then it decomposes into other chemicals. So, for example, it's possible when you identify the differences between weekdays and weekends, Sunday to Monday, and you can really see daily shifts in pollutants. One complication which I mentioned at the end is that it's not just humans contributing toward this. There are a lot of natural sources, and there are also many atmospheric variables which influence concentrations, which makes it very difficult. And we have two research goals in looking into this. The first one, as Georg mentioned, is that it should be possible to identify the pollution above fossil fuel power plants in other countries that don't provide us electricity data. And the second, which I will talk about first, is a general monitor of cities. So you can't pinpoint whether it's transport or industry, but a general monitor of levels above cities. Could you go to the next slide, Georg? Thanks. So first, a couple of images to show a visual representation of this. We're looking at Wuhan, always the place to start with this analysis. And you can see here, we're showing the average levels of nitrogen dioxide pollution in the atmosphere above Wuhan before and after lockdown. As you can probably guess, the dark red is higher levels of pollution, and the darker blue is lower levels of pollution. And you can clearly see in the top image Wuhan in the center this red spot, and in the second image the pollution has cleared. Next slide. Another image here Moscow. Now 2 months later, that was from January, this is from March. And I think actually here it's even clearer. You see the real kind of center of the Moscow pollution and spreading out before lockdown, before there were any implementation. And also in Moscow, they had a very strict and sudden lockdown, and you see the real difference this caused. Next slide, please. So these images are nice, and they're kind of the images that are shared in newspapers and were shared at the time showing, but of course it's nicer to analyze this with graphs. And here we show along the x-axis the date, and along the y-axis the concentration of nitrogen dioxide. And you see a slight seasonality effect, but you can also clearly see where I've drawn the arrow on about the 30th of March, when Moscow enters the lockdown, and there's a significant drop in pollution, which is impressive. This is noticeable because, as I mentioned, there are many other factors causing this. Next slide, please. Same again here for New Delhi. So now in India, 1 week earlier, the lockdown kicked in. And again, you can quite clearly see the drop in pollution about March above New Delhi. Next slide, please. So we're able to access this data, and the nice thing is we can simply draw a polygon anywhere on the map, and we can access data from anywhere we like in the world and investigate it. The big complication comes with what I'm calling estimating the counterfactual, but essentially is the interpretation of these numbers. And the difficulty is, what does it mean? What do these drops mean, or what do the levels mean? And one nice approach which we're considering and currently exploring is trying to estimate a counterfactual. This is difficult because there are so many influencing factors. So I've put here some of the atmospheric factors, which are the wind speed, the wind direction, the air temperature, which influences the chemical reactions, air humidity, and also human factors, weekends, holidays, and the way that air temperature influences human behavior. So we turn on our heaters when it's colder, and this would influence pollution, but you would like to take this out of the equation. So all that being said, it's difficult to simply compare to the previous year. Moscow and New Delhi were very strong examples. That's why you can still see the trend in there. And now the challenge that we're working on is building an algorithm or some other way of interpreting this data. And the final slide, please, Georg. So as I said, the final slide, just to point out, when I mentioned at the start that we had two different kind of research areas. One is looking at cities, and I spent most of the time talking about this. But the other was that we think it will be possible to identify the air pollution above fossil fuel, coal-fired power plants, and we can then use this to proxy for electricity generation in countries who don't provide transparent data. And here I just include one image from the satellite data to show why this should be possible. The black dots are coal power plants larger than 1 gigawatt, so significantly sized. And for example, if you look on the west of the map, I don't know if it's left or right, which way you're looking at it, you can see the black dots that are in isolated areas. So for example, on the east, some of them in the red areas are probably industrial centers, and it will be hard to take away the effect of the power generation. But on the west, you see these isolated plants that have been built in non-industrial areas, I would suppose. And here you can clearly see the kind of circles of pollution around them. And our idea will be tracking this pollution to gain some insight into the production at the power plants. And that's the end of the presentation. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Georg and Ben. This was also really fascinating to see all these real-time data, which can be quite detailed. Now, let me have a quick follow-up question to both of you. Now, Georg, you mentioned that you correlated your energy consumption with industrial production, which sounds quite natural because most likely, I mean, industries are the heaviest users of energy. But I wonder if you can also say something about services, or not, because services are so widespread and don't have specific big consumption during a particular time. People mostly using computers that they can also use from home. But whether it's able to also to say something about services, I would be interested to hear. And Ben, the question to you is that, I mean, it's really fantastic. I mean, that all these details, and it's also a big research program to to look at all the factors that you described. One question is that you show examples from Moscow, from New Delhi, from Wuhan, but do you also have some clearer messages for European countries, cities, or regions? What can we see now in the second phase of the lockdown, or what we saw in March, April, in the first phase of the lockdown? So if you could answer those questions, I would much appreciate.
Yeah, on the server side, for now I can only speculate. What one could try to do is one could interpret electricity consumption. So what we see is like a final profile of the electricity consumption on aggregate. But we know that it is the composite of individual sectors' electricity consumption. And we know the sector sizes in different countries. And one could try with these two pieces of information, so sector sizes and the different profiles of electricity consumption in the different countries, to separate the different waves and say, okay, that seems to be like a profile, electricity demand profile of the services sector, and that seems to be an electricity demand profile of the industrial sector. How detailed and well that's going to work, I'm not entirely sure, especially if you take data for large countries. And so the more you can zoom down to the regional level in terms of electricity consumption. For example, the UK provides this data on the distribution system level for some areas. The easier it gets for you to kind of separate out the effects for potentially different sectors. So it's not, on the one hand, it's an econometric identification exercise. On the other hand, the more detailed data you get to start with, the less noise you will have to interpret. That makes sense to you?
Yeah, thank you. Ben, please.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry that I had not included a European example. I hadn't noticed this, but indeed the same effect holds for European cities. For example, Northern Italy was an example that we saw a lot from early on, and there were certainly big drops, more in the north, in kind of the Belgium, Dutch, German intersection in this big industrial area. There you can also see quite clear drops. So yeah, the message definitely also holds for Europe, and it's applicable here. New Delhi and Moscow are places that have really high levels of pollution, so they were also nice here as the example to really show the clear effect. Because also linking to your second question about what we can learn now from the second lockdown and whether it's as severe, I think it's difficult yet for us to draw any lessons from this before controlling for the other factors. So really, yeah, it's really hard now to kind of have any lessons there and yeah, learn now. I can say that how clearly it is the drops in Moscow and New Delhi. I don't see the same level when I'm looking at it myself. I haven't seen as clear drops anywhere else, but that's really just a personal insight from looking at it. And this is something that will take us longer before we can control for the other factors.
Thank you very much. We also received a couple of questions, but first I will ask Jamie to give his presentation, and I will also ask each of you to have a final few remarks. Now, just let me highlight that the question relates to what policy recommendations can be made based on the data. So you can think about it while Jamie is speaking. For example, one particular issue, whether, for example, it can help us to synchronize lockdown measures, whether it can help us, for example, pollution data, shaping new environmental policies after the pandemic, or help us to better design the green goals. So please think about these questions. But first, let me speak, Sonia, let me give the word to Jamie now. So Jamie, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let me just share my screen so we can start sharing what we are doing here in Latin America, specifically in Costa Rica. And here I'm representing two organizations. One is INCAE Business School, which is a regional business school in Latin America that has as a mission to help governments and organizations to tackle big challenges, just as we are living one. And another one is Social Progress Imperative, which is an NGO that also has as a mission, use data to take better decisions. INCAE is the regional partner of Social Progress Imperative. And given our mission and how we work, the first step was to understand what are the challenges, what is the crisis that we are living. First, this is a global crisis, and we are helping local governments to understand the problems and difficulties that we are having. Because yes, it's global, it started in China, but it's moving very fast. Right now we have COVID-19 cases everywhere and are growing also very fast. It's a long-lasting crisis. This is not like a hurricane, an earthquake, not even the regular social crisis that we are used to. Here we have first waves, second waves, even a third waves. This is growing and this is moving. But also it's a systemic crisis. And that means that this goes beyond health. And we need to tackle like that. And just as Nicola mentioned, we need to understand in an holistic way how this crisis is affecting the different ecosystems of our society, from health, but also to education, to some sectors as tourism, but also to resources as food or water, or tax resources for the government, or even infrastructure. Now we are depending a lot on digital infrastructure, but we don't have the capabilities, or at least not at the beginning, we had the capabilities to have a digital economy just as we need it. Of course, there is some risk also for bankruptcy and some financial crisis there. What have we done? Well, the countries around the world have tried different actions, focusing, of course, on mitigating the COVID-19. But lockdowns, and just as my colleagues just mentioned, have been in the center of the strategies. And the thing here is that lockdowns are very expensive. And the cost of this depends also about your economic structures. If you depend a lot of tourism, of traveling, well, you are going to have very, very high costs in terms of economic, but also social costs. Here in Costa Rica, just for put you an example, 8% of GDP depends on tourism. So lockdowns are very expensive. On the other side, the more digitalized you are, the more capabilities of doing your job from your home, then you are not going to suffer so much. So we have losers and winners with these lockdowns. That's why we start measuring it. Now, also this is this idea of a trade-off between economy and health. And we have seen that mobility is related to economic activity. If I can go out to travel, to consume, to work, then I will have higher levels of economic activity. But also, this mobility increases the risk of COVID-19. That is the issue that we have there, but we need to measure it to know how we are doing it in terms of health, in terms of economic activity, but how to measure mobility, especially when you need to measure it day by day. Well, we start measuring movement of people with Facebook data. And as you can see here in the chart, we have the regions by continent. And you can see that almost all continents did a lockdowns at the end of March and at the beginning of April. And we have changed our recuperation or recovery of mobility very different from region to region, but practically we are behaving all the same. Now, why Facebook data? First, it's open data. We can work on it. It's public. It's daily based. It's information of the people with their cell phones, how they are moving in tiles of 600 meters. And also, and this is really important, they gave us information at subnational levels. That means we can measure between states in the United States, between municipalities in Mexico or Brazil, and we can go and understand the inequalities inside the countries. That's why we use this data. We also start looking for this contrasting between economic growth, between economic conditions, between social conditions, and lockdowns. And we found, of course, that lockdowns are not a silver bullet. By measuring the movement and contrasting with social and economic characteristics, we found that lockdowns are not necessarily equally effective against the virus. And this is really important. And that's why we use this other part that we are measuring, social progress. With a multidimensional indicator like that, we start measuring and seeing what are the social characteristics of the countries in terms of basic medical care, its access to water and sanitation, access to shelter, to personal safety, to access to information and communication, again, digital infrastructures, but also to education, to health and wellness. How are the characteristics of the population in terms of health, but also inclusion. Inclusiveness is really important in terms of this kind of a specific risk where you need that all people follow the same instructions and protocols. So with this information, we analyze behavior and connections in terms of the effectiveness of mobility restriction worldwide. And here we have United States. We have COVID-19 cases, are the orange bars, and we are seeing week by week. And on the line, we have the mobility, also how they have changed. And you can see the lockdown in April, when they have a strong rise on cases, and suddenly they increase the mobility, but they also decrease the number of cases. That means that the lockdown worked. But the thing is, when we start mobility again, the cases start rising again. Okay, we start seeing a pattern there. But we move our analysis to Europe. And in Europe and Oceania, the lockdowns showed a different patterns in terms of the relation with cases. In Germany, for example, we have a strong lockdown. We start moving and increase the mobility, but the rise of the cases was not as fast or big as in United States. The same happened in Italy, in Denmark, in Ireland, in France. In Spain, we already start measuring the second wave. But as you can see, we have a lot of weeks without an increase in cases. And we found the same pattern in all European countries. Now, what happened in a region in Latin America? Well, what happened is there. We have different patterns here. We apply the lockdowns, and as you can see, with a very low level of cases or capabilities of measure the cases. But when we start increasing the mobility, the cases start increasing a lot. Yes, in some places, the decrease of the velocity of the cases was not exponential. But in all countries in Latin America, we saw the same pattern. Increased mobility, increased cases, and practically the lockdown has not the same effects as in Europe. So we start looking for those conditions that are correlated with the lockdown. And we found, of course, shelter conditions and infrastructure, internet and electricity, education and information to follow the protocols, low levels of informality in the job market. Just to remember that in Latin America, we have countries where 60, 70% of the people is informal in the job market. In other countries, Uruguay and Chile, the percentage is like 25. So informality means that you need to go on the streets and work every day. Also, we need to have respect to the law, inclusive health systems and testings, and even the basic things like wash your hands is really important in this region. So given this, we start working with the government of Costa Rica. Our campus is here in Costa Rica, but also we support the countries to take better decisions. So the idea was to design a strategy to avoid generalized lockdowns. We can't afford them. And we start working with the government, with different institutions, to how to use the data to take daily to day strategies. And, and this is, again, Costa Rica can't afford generalized and long lockdowns. Our GDP is going to decrease like 5%, almost 6%. If you contrast it with the history of the country, this is very similar to our biggest crisis that happened in the 80s, where we decreased almost 7%. But also, we don't have the money, the government doesn't have the money to help us to do something against the decreasing economy. If you check the general government gross debt, it's almost 57% of GDP. So we can do these lockdowns. So we start looking to what kind of strategies we can follow. Well, we found that just as between countries at municipal level, and here in Costa Rica, we have 82 municipalities, we found the same patterns. Social and economic context matters in terms of understanding how mobility affect the cases. And we start doing and systematize information. We generate a localized risks and response pandemic tool with Facebook data and social and economic data to inform the strategy day by day. Actually, after this presentation, I have a meeting with the president of Costa Rica to see how this strategy is moving in this week. We measure social conditions, which components of our social infrastructure are the most vulnerable to COVID-19, but also which components of the economy are most vulnerable. The municipalities that depend a lot of tourism are very different from the municipalities that are focusing, for example, in medical devices. And also population age and underlying health conditions are very different between the municipalities. And with this, and the population density and social distancing and mobility of Facebook, we start developing this risk assessment tool where we can see how the mobility is changing day by day. Here in the bar, you can see, for example, that on the Independence Day, everybody moves to the beaches. Talamanca, Aguirre, Osa, Gravito, they are on the Pacific and the Caribbean. So we know that people is moving there. So we need to start doing protocols in order to contain and mitigate the virus there without affecting the rest of the country. And each municipality has its own risk and also its own probabilities of increased mobility without decreased cases, which is the main question here, how we can do these differentiated strategies, informed by data, of course, and differentiate between the changes in mobility, where this mobility is going to increase economy without increasing cases, and where the increase in mobility is going to increase cases and affect the economy. So, of course, what we need to do is keep Costa Rica as the lowest fatality rate of the continent, is what we are doing, but with sustainable strategies. We can't afford the lockdowns here in Latin America. We can do it here in Costa Rica, and we need to balance the epidemiological dynamics with the economic activities. Now we are replicating in Brazil and Mexico. We have the same problems of informality. We have also the same problems of depend of tourism. And we need also to help governments to understand how to use this data day by day, and how, because of the conditions of the society and the economic structures, we can have better strategies. Complement healthcare strategy with an integrated view of what we are doing and we need to do day by day. We have these indicators, these tools where we can see the green, the red, and the yellow to see how we need to adapt our strategy according to the COVID-19, but also to the social and economic pressures that we are seeing. Now, this can help us to integrate the risk assessments, because we already know where we have weak points, where we need to take care, identify and prioritize needs, what do we need in order to tackle the COVID-19, but also to increase the economic activity and guide our response and recovery with data day by day, because we know that this crisis can change one week, another week. The scenarios can be very different. So that's why we need to use this information to have better decisions and put it in governments and help them to understand that we need to adapt our strategy day by day, seeing what's going to happen, and try to focus also not only on COVID-19, but also to think about the society an economy as a whole. So those are the things that we are doing in Latin America.
Thank you, Jamie, so much. I mean, it's really interesting that as you compared Latin America and Europe and the US, and you argued very convincingly that the social and economic context does matter on how different lockdown and other measures can impact the economy and the new rate of infections. And I'm also thankful that you already answered one of the questions that I raised from the audience, namely how this data can be used for influencing real-time policymaking. So as we have only 4 minutes left, let me ask each of you for just a 1 minute, very quick remark on how to use the data that you produce for improving economic policies or social policies or any kind of or environmental policies. So Nicola, very quick response, please.
Maybe the encouragement is to use data in such a way that they become actionable, right? That they allow us especially to reset some of the policies, some of the industries that we have, right? So we commend a lot the work that the Commission has done with the Resilience Recovery Fund to basically look at that as an opportunity to reset entire industry to make Europe greener. So data helps inform better policy, make policy more actionable, but also allow to reset entire parts of the economy and society, which are the opportunity, I think, coming out of this tragedy, which is COVID-19.
Thank you very much. Georg, some quick final remarks.
Yeah, more final remark than a reply. I would like to point out that the exercise that we have done was only possible because the raw data has been made public. So we have this satellite data that has been made public by the corresponding agencies, which is now possible because of faster internet speed, but also because of the desire of the policymakers to do that, and that's great. And the same for the electricity data. It doesn't need to be public, but they choose to do that. And I think there's many more such data that is available and that should be open for research, because there are so many PhD students and other people out there that are looking for exciting ways to use such data and make some interesting things out of that. That the crucial thing should be that not a few companies will in the end sit on all that data and can use it to do very specific consultancy to governments, but that it's quite important that as much as possible that such data is being made public.
Excellent point. Free data access is absolutely crucial. And Jamie, finally, you already mentioned a couple of policy issues, but let me also raise a very provocative comment which was made one of the participants, who said that with the new vaccine arriving, we might not need at all this real-time data, because we will solve the COVID very quickly, and this data have a lot of problems. So what's your view of that? Will the new vaccine make redundant all the work that you have done?
No, I think that actually what we are learning from this is that non-traditional data can help us at least to understand the trends. And this is really important. We are not measuring exactly what we are trying to see, but we are seeing the trends. And in this way, with the vaccine, actually, what we are measuring is going to help, or what we are already measuring is going to help us also to guide the response for the vaccine and to understand when and how to do the logistic to put the vaccine into the populations that need it more. So it's again, if you have the data and these non-traditional statistics, well, how can you translate it into a data tool for decision makers?
Thank you very much. I think this is an excellent closing remark. So my very last task is to thank all of you, to Nicola, Ben, Jamie, and Georg, for your really excellent contributions and discussions. And I think all what you said was really fascinating, and I think helps a lot of our better understanding on what kind of data we need for more well-informed policy decisions, both for economic and social and environmental policies. So thank you so much. And also let me thank for the audience who followed us and asked questions. And I hope to see you at other Bruegel events in the future. Thank you and goodbye.